Hello and welcome to the Michael Harding podcast. I'm sitting here in Donegal. I don't know where you are. You could be in California. You could be in France. You could be in Dublin or Kerry or Cork. Wherever you are, hello and thank you. I did a very emotional one last week I started reading from the book Hanging with the Elephant. It was the second volume in the memoir. It was very much a kind of meditation on my mother, and I found it very kind of healing to read it. So I'm getting into this summer adventure of reading. I said that for the summer, rather than talk too profoundly about the meaning of life and the religion stuff, I would read from some of the books. And it's a series of seven volumes of memoir, a chronicle of ordinary life in Ireland. And I thought, okay, I'll read from them. There'll be nice summer kind of stuff for people, you know. And I found I got a lot out of it myself. I started getting emotional afterwards, because it helped me actually, by reading the whole story of my mother's passing. It did something beautiful inside me. I would have to say and share that with you, you know, that the remembrance of people who are gone can be very healing. And I'll tell you something else. It works, I think, not just to heal the sense of loss, or even to heal the wound. You know, if somebody has passed away, like a parent, and you know, you just have a little bit of pain there because the relationship wasn't great. Well, it's amazing how that can actually heal itself as well. Yeah, it's really amazing. It can heal like the sense of a wound you might have because of a relationship that has, you know, ended in death, and you're bereaved and something was left unsaid. Simply remembering the person is very healing. And I think it happens with people, you know, that you've had a relationship, people that are still alive, you know, that there's something unresolved, there's some pain. And the way you deal with the pain is that you kind of forget the person. But remembering the person can be a way of healing the pain. And there's no secret to it, there's no mystery to it. It's simply, if I sit down and think about my enemy, or somebody who has become my enemy, it's like they're coming into my presence, and it's almost like that your soul is so pure. I believe this now. Your soul is so pure, it cannot tolerate negativity to anybody or to anything. We are as pure as a drop of water. There is a complete, enlightened, pure mind within us. And when you bring that mind, that mindfulness into the room in your own body, that's a good step. But then when you bring some other person into the room by remembering them, you find that your soul insists on compassion. Your soul insists on reconciliation. And that's why in Buddhist practice, you know, the way I'd often talk about how when you're meditating in the Buddhist tradition, it's very useful to not just visualize the Buddha in front of you, or the merit field, or, the kind of cloud of all the good Buddhas in the universe, and, visualizing them or invoking them to come into your presence, that's all really good. But what's also hugely powerful is invoking your friends, your enemies, and people who are strangers. 3 categories. And invoking particular people. You can't have particular people that you don't know, but in a sense you bring all the kind of strangers that are close to you into your presence, and you bring your friends and your family, your close loved ones, your parents. But you also bring enemies, people that you don't like and don't get on with, and you visualize them shoulder to shoulder beside you before you continue with your meditation in the face of the Buddha. And this sense of bringing them to mind, remembering them, bringing them present into the room, where your soul will not tolerate anything less than compassion. So you move forward then with your ritual. It might be Tara practice or Guru Yoga practice. You move ahead with it, and by the time you're finished, something has changed between you and the person who was your enemy. Because an enemy can only stay an enemy if you are forgetful of who they are. If you remind yourself of who they are, not judgmentally, but just as a human being, you cannot but love them. Understanding and knowing somebody with the heart demands love. It is love. It's almost like, there's no such thing as hatred in the world. There's no such thing as sin in the world. It's all about forgetfulness. It's all about you forget who somebody is. That's how we come to hate. So calling to mind the memory of somebody, I find it very, very beautiful. And if you haven't heard last week's podcast, Hanging with the Elephant, give it a listen. Just the whole process of remembering somebody and remembering the details of how they lived or how they died. And it can be a little bit heartbreaking. But anyway, the third book that I went on to write in the memoir series was a book called Talking to Strangers. And I was looking for this sense, the sense of love that you find with your mother or your close family. I began to broaden it out into the sense that, life is sort of a journey. We meet like boats in the night. We meet each other like strangers. And yet there too, there's some kind of connection, relationship, love that exists between us. I feel it every time I do this podcast. I feel like I don't know you. You are a stranger to me. And yet sometimes I meet you on the street or at a show when I'm doing tours, and you say to me, "Oh, I enjoy your podcasts." And I look you in the eye and I feel like, oh, there's a stranger who's really a friend. Because I haven't shared as much in any book or in any newspaper column, which I've been doing for nearly 17 years, but I haven't shared as much at an intimate level as I do in the podcast. It's a privilege for me to be doing it. And rather than talk about the book, I'll read from the book. Its title is called Talking to Strangers. I'll begin now. This one I'll begin at the beginning, very beginning of it, right? Maybe it all began to fall apart for me around the time of my neighbour's death. It was at the end of 2014. He was a good neighbour, and when he died, a part of me died too. That's why I started worrying again, tunnelling into anxiety, looking at my beloved as if I wasn't certain of her love, walking around the garden, worrying if the trees might all die some day, and looking at our little cottage and wondering when it might crumble, or if the roof was about to fall in. I had been living in a solid world. My beloved had been my anchor for years, and our home was a paradise of small things that we could only rely on. The open fire, the bottle of wine, the snow at Christmas, the eyes of a child, the company of friends, the regularity of the farmer next door completing his chores season after season. We lived in an unchanging world, and we watched him through the seasons, moving cattle or mowing meadows, or lodging bales of silage into the rusting red shed to the south of our land. We sat on the porch, holding hands, sipping wine, and listening to the sound of the tractor in the distance. I thought about how we would not even have been there if it had not been for him. My memories of those early years are all sweet and vivid. When we came to the hill for the first time, a wonderful world opened up for us. It was a time of mowing grass, of cutting hay, of swallows flying low across the face of the lawn, of fledgling birds falling out of nests, of liquid blackbirds leading the dawn chorus at 5 a.m, of warm afternoons behind curtains when the birds outside slept so intensely in the trees that I could imagine them snoring little birdie snores. A time of the corncrake in the long grass in the neighbour's land that bordered ours. After that, our neighbour died, and when he died, I would sit on the patio for hours listening for the tractor that never came, gazing at the rushes growing in the empty fields. A shadow drifted across the garden and would not go away, which was strange, as we didn't know him very well. He had rarely spoken, but we could never forget the kindness he had done us, the blessing that he had by accident bestowed on our lives. We were renting an old house outside the village of Kiju. The chimney was cracked and the smoke from downstairs fire seeped through the walls of the upstairs rooms. We were just married, and there was an infant in the cot, but being artists we had no money, and when we went to the building societies and banks in Carrick-on-Shannon, the men in suits behind their desks smiled at us politely and asked if we had jobs. We confessed that we were artists and had no steady income at all. And then we were shown the door. I was convinced that there were only two ways to get money out of a bank. One was to walk in wearing a balaclava and carrying a gun and shoot from the hip, which was something people had done regularly along the border when I was young. The other was to go in wearing a suit and talk from the hip. So I opted for the latter. I would weave a spell around the bank manager about how wonderful I was and how much money I was going to make in the coming years. I would admit that I was a writer, but would say that film was going to be my future. I would produce figures out of the air, projecting income over, let's say, 5 or 10 years, I was going to make hundreds of thousands of pounds. That's what I would say. And then, after a passionate performance, I might ask for a small loan, maybe £20,000. And since the country was in recession at the time, and Leitrim survived on a black economy and small cottages were being sold off very cheap, that might just be enough to buy a house. So in 1994, I sought an appointment with the manager of a bank in Leitrim. And on the day before the meeting, I got a call from a junior staff member. "What's the meeting about?" "I need money," I explained. And she thanked me and said she'd call me back to confirm the meeting. But of course, when she returned my call an hour later, it was to cancel. I suppose they thought the manager was too busy to have meetings with an upstart like me, a failed writer who is simply begging for money. "The manager is busy on Tuesday," she said politely, "but it's really the loans manager that you should be talking to." "OK," I said, "that's fine, sure, that'll be grand." And I put down the phone, though I wasn't at all happy with the situation. I didn't sleep well that Monday night and lay in bed from daybreak on Tuesday, trying to imagine what a loans manager might look like. Perhaps it was just a fancy title for some junior official who had the difficult task of assessing people's credit when, like me, they came cap in hand. If I went to a loans manager, I would be processed and dismissed, because there was no reason anyone should give me money. So I phoned back again. "I need to see the manager this morning," I explained, "and nobody else." "Well, you have an appointment with the loans manager. That's the person you need to be talking to," she said. "No," I said, "it isn't, and I don't." "Don't what?" "I don't have an appointment with the loans manager. I have an appointment with the manager. That's what I arranged originally." There was a pause. "I want to see the boss man," I said. "It's the only option. Is he available or not?" I was using my best accent, an affected posh tone, hoping that I sounded like the bank manager might need me more than I needed him. "Please hold," she said. And, to my delight, after being left waiting for a few minutes, she returned to the phone and said that the manager was willing to meet me. I thanked her as if his agreement was the most normal thing in the world. When I got off the phone, I yelped with delight. I put on a green suit, the one I had been married in, and with a briefcase in my hand, headed out to battle. I sat in his office and tried to bamboozle him with talk about the film industry, literary agents, and advances for screenplays that I was expecting soon, though I had as yet written no screenplays whatsoever. He was a stout man with spectacles and a soft round face. He smiled so warmly from behind his desk that I presumed he knew I was talking rubbish. And when I finished my pitch, we eyeballed each other like gunslingers, each of us waiting for the other to make a move. He moved first. "How much do you want?" he asked. Maybe he was trying to confuse me. I mean, why would he ask such an obvious question? 20K, I replied like I was Paul Newman, and I didn't flinch. He took up a phone and spoke to someone in the next office. "Joe," he said, "could you bring me in forms for a loan account, please? Thanks." He smiled again. "Jesus, that was quick," I blurted out, my affected BBC voice gone completely. He smiled again. "I do a bit of writing myself," he explained. And that was it. And so it was done in an instant, and I had my money, and perhaps all because I knocked on the door of the only bank manager in Ireland with an imagination and a respect for literature and the guts to give a poor writer a financial start. I went home to the beloved, and we made love against the kitchen table that stood on a floor of bare cement, while the child slept in her cot in the only habitable bedroom upstairs. But we had the money. When we were young, that's all we longed for. Money. Because we already had all the love we needed. And of course we longed for a house, which we found one day when the beloved noticed a small cottage for sale in the local newspaper. It stood on 5 acres of land that sloped eastwards towards Lough Allen. The owner was a farmer who had inherited the cottage and land from a relation who had recently died, and his interest was in the land but not the cottage, since he lived in a fine 2-storey house with his mother just a mile down the road. It was a white pebble-dashed cottage, with tiny rooms and small windows, and an ugly cement water tank in the back for harvesting rainwater from the roof. That was the only supply to fill the taps, or the bath, or the cistern for the toilet. But it had a view of the lake, and that was all we wanted. We bought it and began to paint the walls white and construct a wooden shed for fuel outside, and we bought rugs for the living room floor and linoleum for the kitchen. We lit the white Stanley range that had not been warm since the previous occupant had died, and we looked out at the swamp of wild rushes around the house as if we were in paradise. We planted hardwood trees around the house the following winter, and as the trees began to grow and fill out with leaf, first to knee height and then beyond the reach of my raised arms, we felt a deep gratitude to the man who had sold us the property. There wasn't a day that we didn't see him in the fields around us, tending black cattle or mowing grass, or just standing on a headland as still as a bird. The years passed, and the child grew into a young woman, and the trees grew tall and green, but the neighbour maintained his pattern as regular as a clock. He was always there. And after he died, I could still sense his presence in the shadows around the galvanized shed or in the meadow beyond our trees. The hay barn to the south of our land stood silent, but for the wind and the rusty sheets. And Roxy, our cat, would still go down there and sit in the hay that he had saved the previous year. When I went near the shed, Roxy would come out and rub her back leg against mine, pleading with me for attention, as if she were asking something. Where is he? He had been a stranger on the tractor when we met him first. A young man who was shy and talked little. On the day we came to look at the house, he was driving his cattle along the mountain road. He had the keys, and he showed us inside, and then he withdrew to the gate and smoked a cigarette, waiting until we were finished. When we said we loved the house and asked the price, he looked for no enormous profit. When we went back to him 2 years later and asked would he sell us another small parcel of land, 1/3 of an acre on which to plant more trees, he named another modest price, and the solicitors did the rest without fuss. That was 20 years ago, but now he was gone forever. His fields lay silent all through the winter of 2014, and no sound was heard from his Volkswagen Jetta in the distance. January 2015 came and went in a frozen fog, and February was a deluge of rain. I looked out the windows, but nothing came up the hill. I never spoke his name, but his absence had become a thing in itself, an emptiness I could almost touch. The beloved would look at me and ask, "Are you okay?" And I would say, "I'm fine. Maybe I just need to go out for a while." And then I would get into the car and drive around Leitrim or towards Cavan to pass an hour or two, or to cheer myself up by calling on someone I knew. One morning I called on a couple I had known for years, and who had long ago escaped their middle-class youth to live a new age life near the lake. There was no sign of himself when I arrived, and she was standing in the kitchen in a purple dress that smelled of lavender, tea tree oil, basil, and marijuana. As she stirred the basil soup, her partner emerged from the bedroom, a man with long grey hair, wearing a leather biker's suit, with a helmet and balaclava under his oxter. He looked like he was going out to assassinate someone. "I'm going for a ride," he said, cool and understated. When he was gone, I talked to herself, the long cheesecloth, lavender woman, about soups and lentils and how to keep healthy. He returned about an hour later. I heard the muffled sound of the exhaust in the distance, and then through the kitchen window I could see him floating back over the hill and up the gravel avenue like a samurai warrior emerging from a movie screen, and my heart sank because I had enjoyed being alone with her, watching her move about the kitchen in her long dress. He said he'd been to Drumshambo and back. There was something masculine about him in a mythic sort of way that I envied as I nattered with his wife about massage, yoga, and meditation, the usual topics that arise with romantics in Leitrim who have unspoken pasts. But then I mentioned Periscope. I explained that it was a phone app that enabled people to broadcast live, and that I was fascinated by it. She said she didn't have a phone, and she didn't seem to have any notion what the app was I was speaking about. The warrior sat in the corner and rolled a joint. He said that phones fry your brains and cause cancer. He himself was looking very well after his ride, long grey hair to his shoulders and 3 rings on various fingers. He wore a faded blue denim shirt underneath his biker's gear, which he had unfurled to his waist, and he had a saffron scarf around his neck. Given that I didn't seem to realise the evils of mobile phones, he may have felt I needed further education. "Don't you know," he inquired, "that windmills cause drafts? You ever notice that they don't just move in the wind, they actually create the fucking wind?" I said I didn't think that was possible. "Oh, indeed it is," he said. "But," I said, "the windmills generate electricity from the wind. They're not generating the wind. That wouldn't be economical." "The fact is that they move even on days when there is no wind," he explained, with enormous eyes staring at me. "Ask yourself, why is the government subsidizing them?" "That's amazing," I said, "if it's true. But there's more," he added. "More? Yeah." He said, "I was talking to a documentary maker the other night in Manor Hamilton, and he's doing a film about it. Apparently there's a possibility that the government intends storing gas in them, which will be released at night, and the windmills will act as fans to spread the gas across vast layers of mountain bog." "Why?" I wondered. "Pesticides," he replied. It's all about preserving the bogs, like what the EU does with the lettuce. That's why the turf cutting has been banned. They're going to use windmills to spread chemical weed killer so they haven't to get people off the bogs. If you're living close to the windmills, you don't know what's coming out of them at night. There was a pause. He sucked on the joint. It was only noon, and he was already as confused as the cat. Are you living close to any windmills? He wondered. I didn't answer. I tried to focus on the soup and the woman in the long dress. She had beautiful nut-brown hair, and the rich, pungent odour from her clothes was intoxicating me, and the soup she placed in front of me was full of little bits of everything, and it tasted spicy and delicious. After a morning like that, I'd often spend the afternoon on the couch watching recorded episodes of Judge Judy. I didn't walk much in the garden. It's something I used to do before I grew melancholic, but not any longer. The fields held their own melancholy now, and soon the rushes would grow on the fields that my neighbour farmer had mown, and the mountain wilderness of hogweed and gorse would creep back in through the gates and return the land to its unruly origins, as if no man had ever lived or toiled there for all those years. The summer sky was always full of sound in Leitrim, from the booming bittern to the cry of the curlew. But there was no sound as delicious as our neighbour's tractor in a field nearby, as he sat steering and twisting his head to watch the rake toss the mown grass into perfect lines behind him, and later the thump of hay bales being piled into the red galvanized shed where the cat moved in his wake as she hunted for field mice. In November fog, he would drive up the hills with bales of hay sticking out of the boot of his Volkswagen to feed the cattle that were waiting for him in the fields. And later he would move them to lower ground, driving the Volkswagen behind them slowly, his hand out the window, gently banging the outside of the car door to nudge the animals farther down the lane, animals that were as calm and quiet as himself. And like many rural men, he wasn't given to overexcitement. He'd raise one finger from the steering wheel to salute me. If I whispered my enthusiasm for the good weather as we passed, he might agree, but he'd cautiously add, "Will it last?" I remember watching him one summer evening when he had finished his work and the sloping grass had been shaved to its yellow roots. He stood alone on the brow of the hill. He was having one last look at the field, and the smoke of his cigarette dissolved in the air around his head. I said to myself, there's a man who is satisfied with his work. There's a man who is proud of his land. The little church in Erigna was so full for his funeral that I couldn't get in, so I stood with dozens of other men outside on a dry day in November. The slanting sun cut into our faces as the coffin was shouldered towards the cemetery. It was no big deal. People were just there to witness the closure of a simple life, to celebrate a quiet man who walked deeply on the earth and loved its colours. When a farmer dies in the countryside, there is a strange emptiness in the fields. They grow ragged with rushes, and without paint, the galvanized sheds turn to rust after a few years. Then, eventually, the forestry arrives, and all trace of human habitation is swallowed by the dark woods. Those of us who live in the hills above Lough Allen had lost another solitary man. And all across the west of Ireland it was the same. One by one, the lights were going out. Our neighbour's death changed something in me. It would not be possible to go on as before, as if we were young, having barbecues and waving at the world like young people do. Our neighbour was the closest human being to us in the isolated world of rural Ireland where we had found our paradise. Though he never spoke much with us, we could feel and see his love in the fields and in the cattle every day of the year. I didn't tell the beloved I was brooding. All through the winter of 2014 and the spring and summer of 2015. I pushed myself hard. I kept myself busy. I travelled to Romania and toured Ireland and worked on a play in Dublin just to feel alive, to feel connected. But each time it was the opposite. I felt more and more distant from others. Even my beloved became a stranger when we were sitting on the couch together and being still. Until eventually in the summer of 2015, sitting at the breakfast table with boiled eggs and her trying to get the shell off her egg without burning her fingers, she suddenly said it. I need to go away, but it'll only be for 9 months. I said, oh yeah, sure, that's fine. Inside I was thinking, that's not fine. Everything is going to fall apart now, just like the philosophers say. I didn't know if I could manage on my own. I feared that 9 months might be long enough for a couple to drift apart, and that this might be the beginning of a separation, and that the permanence of our paradiso in the little cottage might be disintegrating. But if it was, what could I do? The universe unfolds and events arrive, and things change, and the cookie always crumbles in the end. That's life. Well, that is life. That's the start of the story. Talking to strangers. And I think it is a reality that happens in any relationship, in any life. There's a time where you have the great breakdown, where halfway through life you end up lost in the woods and you don't know how to get out of it and you don't know how to cope. And that needs a change of life. That needs some sort of reliance on a wisdom creature or a divinely inspired goddess or somebody to lead you out of the woods. And it's something that happens to everybody. And I suppose when it happens, it's important to know that it's natural and normal. And that's what I covered, I think, in the book Staring at Lakes. But then there's the time that you put together. You out of that first crisis, I think, in life, you reconstruct yourself. And that's when usually people find permanent relationships. They begin to settle down. They begin to say, let's really, in the face of how fragile life is, let's build our paradise. So you've been through some trauma. You've had a kind of a breakdown. You live as a young boy for too long. I'm speaking as a man. But you live as a young boy for too long. You party too long until you get tired of the party. And then the whole thing falls apart and you don't know what you're doing in life. Then you pull it together. And then you realize life is about somebody else. Life is about a relationship. Life is about, thinking about somebody else. And so you end up falling in love and you build your paradise. And then what happens? That begins to crumble too. Because nothing's perfect. And we bring to a marriage or a relationship the imperfections that we have and the selfishness that we have. And I suppose talking to strangers is partially a meditation on that second phase in the journey of life, in adulthood, where you've put together the paradiso, you've put together your little dream, but then even that goes stale. I won't tell you what else is in the book. Obviously, it's too complicated. Suffice it to say that it turns out well in the end. I think it turns out well largely because there's a sense of, I suppose what was growing in me all through the years was a sense of faith. You know, I was following modernity. I was trying to be a writer. I was trying to be a playwright. And I was enjoying it. I was living in a world, I suppose, where it seemed like, religious experience or faith experience was a thing of the past. It was so completely associated with either conservative, intolerant morality in relation to particularly sexuality in women, or else it was associated with the scandals of sexual abuse. And that really for 30 years was the whole realm of religion and churches in Ireland. And I think we're only coming out of it. I don't think we are out of it yet, but I begin to see the kind of green shoots of a new beginning, as they say. I begin to hear more and more people now talk about faith experience in a positive way, in a way that says, look, we can actually leave the institutional stuff aside for a while. We can move out from the constricted morality that people find is intolerant or is lacking compassion. We can move out and just be here now in a present but faithful way, faithful to Christ, faithful to a sense of the Christian tradition. We can be who we are and still carry with us this sense of faith. And I think that's the transition that's happening now in Ireland, and I think it's beautiful, and I think it gives me hope for the future. So I'm not going to go into all the stuff in talking to strangers, but next week I'll go on to the third book in this series of memoirs. It's called On Tuesdays I'm a Buddhist. And I suppose that's the one where I had to really commit. I had to find again what had always been there. That I'm living in modernity. I'm living a modern life. I'm trying to be as good as I can as a writer or a playwright. And secretly in the heart, I still have this sense of the faith, the Christian tradition that I was ordained into as a priest, the Christian tradition that I was baptized into as a baby and grew up with in the schools, and loved. I mean, I cannot stop telling you how much a refuge the church, the little quiet oratories in the world were to me all through my life, from the time I was an adolescent, a teenager, slipping into the dark shadows of the cathedral in Cavan. That place and that red sanctuary lamp were always, for me, a beautiful, beautiful refuge. A place of peace, a place that I felt affirmed in being loved and in my capacity to love others. So that was all the time coming and going. And I suppose Talking to Strangers is a story of trying to find identity, trying to find ancestors, trying to find meaning in life, trying to find a kind of a life as an actor, as a playwright. It incorporates talking to strangers. I tell the whole story of doing the Bull McCabe in John B. Keane's play, Master Play at the Field, which was the 50th anniversary production in the Gaiety Theatre in Dublin. It was such a privilege to be able to do that for 6-7 weeks. So Talking to Strangers it's a book about trying to get on with life. You know, when you've pulled your life together, you've made a life with your partner, you're beginning to start a family, there's a great cohesion. And there's a great sense of meaning, and there's a great sense that you found paradise. But there will come a time in that relationship as well, and even with your family, where things will go flat and you'll experience it as stale. And what do you do then? And I suppose that's where I found even a deeper level of faith and joy, as I was talking about last week. You know, to have joy in your heart is something that no riches can buy you. And yet that joy in your heart is available right now, in this moment. Because to be here now, to allow yourself to float on the great ocean of conscious love that emanates in every atom of the universe, to just feel yourself in existence, to let go of the narrative of who you are and experience your being at the deepest, even below and beneath and beyond and above your breath, deeper than your breath. I always say that, you know, in the St. Patrick prayer, Christ beside me, Christ below me, the prayer doesn't mean some sort of ghostly figure, Christ floating above your head and below your feet and behind you and in front of you. No, the prayer is like the expression of a meditative alertness, where the cosmos around you becomes so real. Whatever is around you at this moment, let it be real. Whatever's behind you, are you in a room? What's in front of you? What's below you, above you? What is all around you in this moment as you be here now? And to understand and realize that this kind of great pulse that we call reality, this kind of quantum energy in front of you, before you, behind you, every bit of it is already the cosmic Christ, the complete coming into being, the complete incarnation of being. And you're in it. Not only are you in it, you are it. You are the consciousness coming to being. You are God made manifest in this moment. You get to that stage of being in that moment. I think it's impossible to hold your attention there without experiencing a whole tsunami of joy. It's like a dam burst of joy. Not as a joy that you achieve, because joy can't be achieved, but as joy that is discovered. It's like you discover it like a huge ocean inside you. You discover it like a huge lake. It's just like within you, this joy. And the more that you can let go of your narrative, your psychological identity, your everything that constitutes you, and just be, you realize that ocean is the ocean of joy. There's so much joy that it's almost unbearable, and that's why we run away from it. Mankind cannot bear too much reality. Look, we're moving beautifully now towards the 12th of July, towards all sorts of wonderful celebrations of summer, festivals all over Ireland, and I'm sure wherever you live, I hope there are wonderful summer festivals. And I'm going to continue sharing stories from the memoirs through the summer. And thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.